Welcome to Chapter 13, where we will be discussing, fairly briefly, conflict and peacemaking. A lot of the concepts in this chapter are sort of reapplications of concepts that we've talked about in previous chapters, so that's why this will be fairly brief. I'm not going to bore you with being super redundant. All right, so let's get to the redundancies I'm going to indulge in. So first off, what creates conflict? One of the primary sources of conflict would be social dilemmas. Social dilemmas, as you recall, is when there is some kind of social trap, which means that the conflicting parties are each pursuing their own self-interest. And both parties are not going to achieve that goal, but they're both pursuing it. And if one of them gets their goal met, then that by definition means the other one's not going to. So that's going to lead to mutually destructive behavior as each individual or each country or each group is working towards their own self-interest to the detriment of the other. And in fact, possibly to their own detriment. I'm reading a history book and they're currently talking about the Cold War, and that the premise was have enough nuclear warheads to ensure destruction of your enemy. And of course, if one side launches their nuclear warheads, the other one is going to automatically hit the button and launch theirs too. So they called this mutually assured destruction. Like, that is the maximum social trap we could imagine, right? Where entire countries would be wiped out because each party has their own self-interest. And if one pursues that, trying to rule or take over or whatever, the other one is going to immediately react, and they end up both suffering as a result of it. So these kinds of social traps oftentimes cause this kind of mutually destructive behavior. And of course, each side would like to have their interests met the most, but while also avoiding, mutually assured destruction in the case of nuclear attack. But in other situations, we could kind of call it like mutually assured destruction light, where like neither of us gets what we really want. Neither of us gets anything like what we really want. We can kind of avoid that by maybe not just blindly pursuing our own self-interest. So some social dilemmas that we've already talked about in class. We talked about the prisoner's dilemma, right? And the idea that if you cooperate, you can end up doing much better. This one has different values as the reward. But you could end up both doing really well if you cooperate. But what typically happens when people are playing this as a game, and then also when you look at it in real life, a lot of times one of the suspects will in fact talk. And that person will get the benefit and the other one will get the harm, right? So one of the things we noticed when we talked about the prisoner's dilemma before is that people will display evolving motives. Remember, we talked about how if one person in a game of the prisoner's dilemma, if one person notices that the other one's been cooperating, they might change their strategy to start cooperating also. Maybe they start to feel guilty because they keep getting the high points and the other person's getting nothing or getting 1 point. And they're like, oh, I do kind of feel bad about this. So maybe I'll start cooperating. Or maybe they start to realize that cooperation is better for both parties, right? With the prisoner's dilemma, I talked about this before, the idea that it's perceived by each player as a zero-sum game. The idea that I win, you lose. That's a zero-sum game. One of us gets it and the other one doesn't. But if a person recognizes that in fact a lot of these social dilemmas, like the prisoner's dilemma, is really not a zero-sum game. That if I stay quiet and you stay quiet, we both get just 1 year, right? If one of us sings and the other one doesn't, we can end up with both of us being harmed, or one of us being harmed a lot and the other one not being harmed very much at all. So the idea with the prisoner's dilemma is that the players can start to realize that, wait a minute, it's not like I'm getting 5 points and you're getting 0. I'm getting 5 and you're getting 1. Okay, hold on. We're both getting something. Maybe it would be better if we cooperated and we both got, the better outcome. So once they realize that it's not a zero-sum game, people's behaviors oftentimes will evolve. Another social dilemma is what we call the tragedy of the commons. And, when we have, things that are set aside and everybody's supposed to share it, a lot of times people feel like a couple of things. One thing that they might be thinking is, it's not really mine. It's not really anybody's. And so it's okay if I take a little piece of it. Like, when you go to the beach, I thought we're supposed to pick up shells. I thought we were supposed to look for sand dollars or, sea stars or whatever. Thought we were supposed to do those things. And I thought that was part of the thing of going. Well, if we all go there and we all take one thing with us, then we're going to leave the common area, these public beaches or the forest or wherever we are. We're going to leave this common thing with less, and in fact end up with nothing, right? When we all work in our own self-interest, well, one time I took my children to Yosemite, and my husband's friend was a ranger there. And so we were staying in the ranger's quarters and stuff. And so we went down to the Merced River that's right there running through the valley. And we're playing around on the shore and, wading into it and whatever. I discovered later that my 6-year-old has her pockets just completely filled with rocks that are pretty that she pulled out of the river. And I said, you can't take rocks like this from the national park. And she said, but I mean, there are so many rocks and I just have this many. I can take this many home. I'm like, you can't take any of these. This belongs to everyone. And my poor little 6-year-old was like, what are you talking about? I have this tiny handful of rocks and there are, uncountable numbers of rocks just like it in the river. I did make her take them back because, being a good social psychologist, I'm aware that her little pocket plus another little kid's pocket plus another kid's little pocket. And next thing you know, we've got sand in the Merced River. You should not be taking things when you're in a national park. There's a big scandal going on right now down in, I'm not sure if it's Bryce Canyon or Zion. It's one of those that's down in southwestern Utah. People who go out hiking into the backcountry have been doing those piles of rocks, where you stack them one on top of the other. And it's a challenge to do it and it looks cool and stuff. But now apparently there are thousands of them out there. So when you go to look at what had been, a different landscape, now it's just full of these piles of rocks. And people are really outraged that people are coming out here and putting out these piles of rocks. I think it's funny. You're outraged, but you don't knock them down. It's like, make them not be piles of rocks. But what seems like just one person having fun and doing something actually has an impact on everyone's experience of that destination. And I think a lot of times we forget that, we put a pile of rocks and then, tomorrow 2 people come out, see our pile of rocks and think that looks like fun. And so they each make a pile of rocks. And then the next day, 2 more people come out and they all make rocks. And next thing you know, you've got hundreds or thousands of piles of rocks. And, that it really is something that can damage everybody's experience. But when it belongs to the commons, none of us feel personally like our little behavior is going to impact the larger thing, that anything we're going to do is really going to matter. So that's one factor in the tragedy of the commons, is that people feel like their little part isn't going to be harmful. And then the other part is that a lot of people contribute to the tragedy of the commons where they say, you know what, this isn't going to last, so I need to take advantage of it before it's gone. And so they feel justified in taking a piece or leaving their mark or whatever because, it's not going to be here forever. And I recognize that. And I'm actively contributing to that actually happening, but I feel entitled to do it because, this is the last chance to do it. And so when we have things that are shared by everyone and nobody feels responsible for it, they may work in their own self-interest rather than in the interest of the larger good. Another contributing factor in the social dilemma world is the tendency to display the fundamental attribution error. So when we are competing or whatever, we feel entitled to compete with somebody else or with a faceless group or whatever, because we feel like, well, they deserve it. We assume that any misdeeds that they've committed, any bad behavior we've observed from them is evidence of how they really are, right? Like that's not due to situational factors. It's due to how they are. And then we feel entitled to sort of retaliate against how they are. They don't deserve to share this anyway. So I'm going to go ahead and take my portion or more than my portion. because I'm a good person and that person's a bad person because I saw them engage in a behavior that I don't approve of, or I heard that they engaged in a behavior that I think is wrong. So we do something wrong because we think that our opponent, the person we're competing against, is fundamentally a bad person and they deserve to lose and not have any portion. So you can see how these kinds of social dilemmas are sort of fueled by the thinking strategies that go into, seeking our own goals, right? Trying to fulfill our own needs and to the detriment of others, and sometimes to the detriment of ourselves, right? You go back to Yosemite and you're like, how did this river get sandy? It's because in the 10 years since you were there, every day somebody took a pocket full of rocks out, and that's how it ended up like this. So we have to be really careful as we're moving through the world to think about, each of our personal behaviors can have an impact and, harm everybody, even harm the thing that you're actually, you like and that you want to have, for the future or whatever. A lot of times people think their own water usage isn't really going to have an impact on, the water situation in their area. They're like, well, I'm just one person. So what if I let the sink run while I'm brushing my teeth? It's 2 minutes of the sink running. How much can I possibly be wasting? And in the scheme of, my neighbor waters his alfalfa, I mean, my little bit of water is nothing. But really, if everybody's thinking like that, and there's hundreds of thousands of people that live in your area, you can all be having a really big impact, right? And that's the thing we have to remember, is that little tiny bits all add up when you have, a lot of people. So what can we do to resolve these social dilemmas? Well, I'm going to go ahead and stop here. My air conditioner just kicked in to make a bunch of noise anyway. So I'm going to stop here and we'll come back in the next segment. We'll talk about, well, what can we do to fight against these natural tendencies?